Since you brought up the judges, I would like to point out that the judges in this country are acting erroneously. We have judges who are acting as partisan activists from the bench. They are trying to dictate policy from the President of the United States. They are trying to clearly slow walk this administration's agenda, and it's unacceptable. As the President said last night, we will continue to comply with these court orders. We will continue to fight these battles in courts. But it's incredibly apparent that there is a concerted effort by the far left to judge shop, to pick judges who are clearly acting as partisan activists from the bench in an attempt to derail this president's agenda. We will not allow that to happen. And not only are they usurping the will of the president and the chief executive of our country, but they are undermining the will of the American public, tens of millions of Americans who duly elected this president to implement the policies that are coming out of this.
And that was Caroline Levitt, one of our favorite MAGA women. I'm Claire Potter.
And I'm Neil J. Young.
And Neil, it's so great to see you this week. Before we circle back to Caroline and the news and today's episode, I'll see you in court. Let's talk about our great success at the New Republic this week.
Yeah, we had an article that came out a few days ago. I'm not remembering the headline. Maybe you know the title of it, Claire. Is it there for you? Anyway.
Oh, yes, I've got it right here. J.D. Vance likes normal gays. Should we count that as a win? And we're going to include it in the show notes. And it was about, tell everyone, Neil.
Well, we used this sort of hook from the fall, which was what J.D. Vance telling Elon Musk, I think about a week before the election, that he predicted that Trump would win the normal gay vote. And that combined with the Supreme Court case that the court is hearing right now about parental rights and sort of LGBTQ books in a Maryland school district, and sort of legal and potentially illegal, case over normality. We thought it would be a great moment to look at the history of the movement for gay folks to be rendered normal across the 20th and 21st century. And so we had a lot of fun writing it together, and it was we've had great feedback on it as well. So people should check it out.
Yeah, and there's going to be a link in the notes. And I just want to say, Neil, you are a dream to write with. And
right back at you.
Well, and I could not have even approached this topic without having read your wonderful book about gay Republicans. We were able to draw on a lot of research you had done and really link it to the present, where there are, in fact, all of these gay MAGAs who are very attached to the movement that people like J.D. Vance are very involved with, like Peter Thiel.
Yeah. And ultimately, our argument is that the sort of category of normality or the status of normal is one in which, LGBTQ people from across the political spectrum and all walks of life have contributed to and sought, and that also we wanted to serve as a bit of a warning for where that discourse and that categorization is headed, particularly as it gets wielded by folks like Vance.
Yeah, and our friend Katha Pollitt asked us a really interesting question in another forum, which is, well, what's the choice other than to become normal? And that's something I'm kind of chewing over a little bit. We both had an answer for that, but it might be the grounds for another collaboration.
I love that.
All right. So, Neil, in the news this week, let's start with the New York Times, which on Monday reported that because of Trump administration cuts to domestic aid programs, food banks around the country are running out of food. This is also reverberating out to local farms. The $1 billion in aid that was cut from the FDA budget in March included the Local Food Purchase Assistant Cooperative Agreement, which connects local groups and schools to local farms so that there is fresh produce and milk and meat from these farms flowing into these institutions. It helps the farmers. It helps people who need nutrition. What could be wrong with it? Neil?
Yeah. So first of all, this is, just devastating for what this means for, I think, thousands and thousands, maybe even millions of Americans who rely on these food banks for, some amount of their sustenance. But I also think, I did not know, and it now seems obvious, but I did not realize to what extent farmers also use this as a source of business for,
Right.
many of them do, or that it comprises a good chunk of how they make a living as farmers. And I think that's a sort of reverberation that just is, for me, unexpected, and learning more about this story. But it just speaks to the ways think, the ways in which I think Trump's decisions have multiplying effects for
Hmm.
how devastating they are. And I think we're seeing that in the economy in the early stages of it, but it's only going to increase in the weeks ahead. But this is just a particularly sad one.
Well, and this was a particularly good program too, because it was also very green. Instead
Right.
of shipping
Yes.
beef patties that have been manufactured in Oklahoma to Pennsylvania by truck and putting all that carbon in the air, you have a farmer who's giving grass-fed beef
Hmm.
to schools and food banks and so on. Um, to just pause on the schools for a second, this is really reminiscent of the Reagan administration cuts to school nutrition. And remember the
Yeah.
big joke at the time, which was
Ketchup
actually
would be it.
real. Yeah,
Yes.
that ketchup was one of the vegetables.
Yeah.
Um, and so there seems to be something very deep in Republican DNA that they really don't want kids to have good food in schools. But the food bank thing is reminiscent of something else. And tell me if I'm going too far with this. But, one of the reasons that Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected, and one of the reasons he was able to push New Deal programs, was that local food banks and charities and church kitchens and so on completely collapsed under the weight of the need in the
Right.
early years of the Great Depression. And, we have a sort of coming storm. There will be greater unemployment. There will be people losing shifts. This is inevitable from the tariffs, and so this is the worst possible time for food banks to be going under.
Yeah, and I don't think you're pushing that analysis too far at all. I think that's spot on. And I think that, that has been that's a huge conservative argument over the course of the 20th century, that the federal government is involved in things, especially along these lines, that it shouldn't be, this is the work of
Right.
private charity and of individuals, and particularly of churches. And of course, that argument over the 20th century flew in the face of what we knew of all the historical conditions that had led to
Right.
FDR and the other developments of the federal government through those decades. But I think what we're about to see as all these things collapse, that that won't come to be. Churches are not going to fill in the gap. Private individuals and charities are not going to do it. And to whatever extent they do, is only a continuation of the work they already do, but is not enough to support the work and to cover the people and to remedy or address these issues in the way that a large federal government can. But it's going to be lessons learned. But the people who are most vulnerable are going to are going to be the recipients of those lessons, most harshly.
Well, and one of the most graphic pieces of bad public relations for the Hoover administration at the beginning of the
Right.
Great Depression was that on the one hand, you had hungry people in cities, and on the other hand, you had farmers pouring milk into ditches
Right.
and slaughtering animals and burying them because they couldn't sell them. And
Hmm.
so, what we may see here is a kind of rolling breakdown in that
Yeah.
kind of connection between different needs that the federal government has met by pinning them together.
Yeah, and we've already had, I think, a little bit of a foreshadowing of that, or the early chapter of it, with loss in the reduction in workers
Yeah.
in many of these agricultural spaces. So, right, those early pictures in sort of the first month or two of the administration, and I think that, like, that's sort of the early iteration of this. But you're right, like, we might be sort of rocketing towards a future where there's lots and lots of hungry Americans, and lots and lots of food and farm products, being put to waste at the
Yeah.
same time.
Yeah. Well, the other thing that's been dominating the news this week is that we're at the 100-day mark for the Trump presidency. I think now it's actually the 101st or the 102nd day. And we've had a lot of reports on what has and has not happened. Of course, the president's team is full of joy and glee about everything they believe he's accomplished. We had a cabinet meeting the other day where they go around the table and everybody praises him for doing things that actually haven't really been done. But the president himself marked it with a rally outside Detroit where he did two things. One is he threatened to quote unquote slaughter automakers who don't bring all their operations back to the United States as soon as possible. And then once again, he forced Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan, on stage to appear with him. I want to ask you about both things, Neil. The first 100 days paradigm and how that reflects on Trump. And then I want to talk a little bit about what is his thing about forcing Gretchen Whitmer to come and stand with him all the time.
Well, on the first 100 days thing, I think I would add to our discussion did you see this picture of Fox News and the Chiron, or the slide they prepared for viewers, which had 3 bullet points on it of touting like his accomplishments. I mean, I don't remember all 3, but one of the 3 was declassifying the JFK assassination files. I mean, that's like
That's a
how
big deal.
that's the barrel that they're scraping to the bottom
Yeah.
of, right? So, this is significant. I don't think it at all represents, Fox News turning on Trump, but it also was a really embarrassing thing for them to put together, and that
Right.
these were the 3 things that they could come up with. But I want to talk about the Whitmer of it all, because
Okay.
I think, first of all, this just fits within a characteristic pattern of this man, that he makes people, he relishes in humiliation. And I don't necessarily think that Whitmer's being humiliated here, because I think she's a savvy politician who is doing a dance in order um, to benefit Michigan. I mean, part of this is in keeping a large military base,
Yep.
for not being shut down in her state, which it's thousands and thousands of jobs. Um, I do think some of the stuff she's doing feels a little creepy, or just, it doesn't feel good for those of us who want like no bending of the knee to Trump. But I think she's doing a dance that probably she thinks is best serves her citizens. But I think he absolutely believes that he's humiliating her, and that he's sort of turned a critic into a sycophant, which is what he ultimately wants of all the people around him. And so I think that's what's at work. But then, of course, there's also the gender dimension of this, right?
Right.
She's a beautiful woman. I think he likes having any beautiful woman fawn over him, and he doesn't care what the circumstances of
Right.
that are. If he has to pay for it, or if he has to, politically pressure them into doing it. And that seems to be a big part of what's happening here.
Yeah. I also think it's interesting. I guess there are two pieces of this I've been thinking about. One is the first 100 days paradigm, which, to go back to our first news
Yeah.
item, was established by Franklin Roosevelt. And he
Right.
came in and for 3 months pushed legislative package after legislative package after legislative package through. And they were big packages. I mean, transformative packages. What I find interesting about Trump is there has been virtually no legislation
Right.
in the first
Yes.
100 days. There have been all of these executive orders. There's been all of this activity, but there hasn't actually been much that has been accomplished. I suppose if you care about deportations, you can say, well, he's been deporting people, but he actually hasn't deported people at an any faster rate than any other president.
Right.
So, but there's been a lot more attention to it, and a lot more attention to how it's being done, which we're going to talk about a little later in the episode. But he's not really doing anything. I do wonder whether the first 100 days paradigm is a little worn out in this day and age, and whether the media ought to just drop it.
I mean, it feels like they should, because I don't know what this is useful as a sort of like period of analysis, but I do think it's one in which presidents themselves are mindful of. And so it becomes a bit of a structure or a framework through which they also perceive their own
Right.
initial actions, and how they sort of introduce and establish their presidency. And so I think like that can be useful for a sort of self-consciousness on the part of presidents to have about how they begin an administration. Of course, all that self-consciousness, all that historical understanding, we might as well throw it out the window with everything else when it comes to Trump, because it's not as if that's an operating mechanism here for what they're doing. They're doing what they're doing because, not because of 100 days notion, but because this is what they said they were going to do in Project 2025, and they're going to keep doing this for the next hundreds
Right.
of days anyway, at probably the same clip, unless someone does something about this.
I noticed he did wait until the 101st day to fire Mike Waltz.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And, I would be willing to bet you or anyone in the audience that Pete Hegseth has about another week. But
I think that's right. But again, I don't think Trump is mindful of these 100 days any more than
no.
he's mindful of, anything else. But I think a Stephen Miller type is probably keeping track of that, right? So is the idea there to do that after the 100 days so it doesn't really get counted in that sort of historical
Right.
assessment? Yeah.
Because it's a failure. I mean, even
Right.
Trump knows it's a failure.
Right.
He can
Yeah,
spin
yeah.
it any way he wants, but either he was wrong to choose Waltz in the first place, or Waltz failed. Waltz did something terrible
Well,
on
right.
his
And this is
watch.
the most consistent pattern of his
Right.
first administration, right? Was like constantly firing people. And then he's caught in that bind
Right.
of, did I make a failure as a person hiring? Did they prove to be disloyal? I mean, that's what the sort of loyalty oath becomes really useful for him, because then it comes not about like his own assessment of them as like capable in the job. It becomes some sort of, character betrayer on their part about their relationship to him.
I agree. I agree. And then the other thing I've thought about a lot is I have wondered whether it was all a plan to begin with, that it didn't really matter who was in these top spots in the cabinet, that it's really the people we don't see who matter.
Mm,
And that is something that obviously will take several decades of distance to really understand. But it seems to me there are too many people who are too inexperienced and too incompetent in these forward facing positions, and that the expectation is that they'll be on television, they'll do well on television. Christy Noem's various photo shoots in El Salvador and so on, that they're very practiced at public relations, but that
yeah.
somebody else is really doing the work. And that what the Trump administration is beginning to figure out is, even if other people are doing the work, it's the people at the top who make the most terrible errors.
Yeah.
Or the most visible ones.
Right. Visible. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So let's move on to our last news item, which I'm not sure really matters, or we'll find out whether it matters in the coming weeks. The Wall Street Journal broke a story yesterday morning that Tesla's board initiated a search for a new CEO about a month ago. Now, everyone is now denying it, which seems to be the world we live in now. Somebody
Yes.
tells the truth, everybody denies it. We actually know
happened.
it's true. And yeah, exactly. But we're supposed to pretend it isn't true. But it's hard to believe that after a 71% earnings fall off in the first quarter and a 42% decline in the company's stock, that no one is having this thought that it's time for Elon to step back, much less acting on it. Neil, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, the board cannot allow this to continue. No normal board would preside,
Right.
looking at this company's collapse, sit there and do nothing about its leadership. So that seems perfectly reasonable for the way in which the corporate board would respond. And it also doesn't seem like Musk has any interest in running this company anymore. And so why this is even being why this is being protracted, I don't know, other than just like it takes a while to find the CEO. But like, I think the more interesting thing is just this constant information cycle we're in, which
Right.
is that, again, as you said, like something is reported out solidly. You said it was the Wall Street Journal that reported
Oh
on
yeah,
this,
it's the
right?
Wall Street
Like this
Journal.
is like
They are
they're not
never
going to
wrong about this
no,
shit.
they're not going to
No.
publish something that hasn't been highly sourced, that they don't have
Right.
like multiple confirmations of.
Right.
And but also no one has to take accountability for facts anymore, and they can deny this, and then there'll be a new CEO named in a couple of days, and then the story will be about some sort of attack on the media, and like how dare they like come into this private negotiation or whatever it is. But here's where we are.
Well, Neil, and before we switch to our focus for today, which is the courts, I do want to say that I find this particular moment in political history eerily similar to my life as a college teacher. And see if you recognize this. The number of times that you'll be sitting in your office and, a paper is due and the deadline has been published for weeks and weeks and weeks, and everybody has known what they were supposed to do, and a student walks in at the last minute and gives you this entirely improbable explanation
Yeah.
about why they can't hand their paper in. And it's a hideous lie, and it's a hideous lie, and you're all sitting there pretending that it's not a hideous lie, because it would be cruel to say, seriously, you expect me to believe that?
Right.
And then you sort of negotiate the whole thing, and the student leaves, and you end up thinking, why didn't you just come and tell me you didn't get your homework done? Why
Yeah.
did you have to make up this story about it? And I feel like so much of our political life now and our economic life is being lived this way, of improbable stories being issued that we're all supposed to say, oh yeah, that's true. And in our hearts, we know that something else entirely is happening.
Yep.
Okay, so let's turn to our main focus for the day, Trump and the courts. Our clip at the top from Caroline Levitt was from March 19th, and it came after a very busy week in which one federal judge had blocked DOJ from making further cuts. Another judge had blocked a Trump executive order banning transgender troops from the military, and a third had blocked further deportation flights to El Salvador after a judge had tried to get a plane turned around in midair and the Trump administration refused to do it. So, what Caroline Levitt is arguing in that clip we started with is that the Democrats are just out there judge shopping, and that they just go to a judge and a judge makes an injunction and it stops an entire political process for the entire country. I just want to start by saying, Neil, what does Caroline Levitt actually mean by judge shopping? Because I'm not sure our listeners understand it.
Yeah, it wasn't a phrase that I was familiar with, but it seems to be something that's sort of becoming more prominent in the discourse. This idea that litigants were choosing a court or a judge that they knew to be sort of aligned with their view, and they were doing so in order to get a favorable judgment, and that this is what Democrats were doing in order to move things against Trump. Which is not what's happening, but that is not to say that judge shopping isn't a thing that happens. There are sort of, I wouldn't necessarily call them loopholes, but just sort of the technicalities of the ways in which cases get assigned to judges. There's opportunities there to sort of game the system, and plaintiffs from across the political spectrum have used this to their advantage, and lots of different examples. For a really prominent one is this judge in Texas, I believe in Amarillo, who is a lone judge on a district court or something. So he is an outspoken conservative. He is incredibly anti-abortion, and the anti-abortion movement has specifically directed their legal cases towards his court using this judge shopping strategy, and they have benefited from that. So it's a thing that exists. It is not the thing that is leading to these decisions against Trump. We also know that Trump has absolutely had an incredible effect on shaping the judiciary as it is now constituted right now. So this is a very Trump-friendly, or at least a Trump-inflected judicial system that we have in this country. Caroline Levitt is, spinning as she always does.
Yeah, and I just want to point out to our listeners, we're very, very focused on the Supreme Court. And, when a president gets elected, how many appointments will they have
Right.
on the Supreme Court? It is equally, or perhaps even more important, how many appointments they get on the appeals courts, in the U.S. district courts, and so on. Because those courts, as you said, can actually throw a wrench into the system and make everything stop. Okay. Um, and so getting those appointments in at lower levels is really, really important. I'm glad you mentioned Matthew Kaczmarek because, of course, he was very important to the Mifepristone case. And I think,
Hmm.
specifically in 2023, he issued a nationwide injunction ordering the FDA to withdraw approval for mifepristone. I think that was unprecedented that a
Yeah.
district judge would actually say to an independent federal agency, you have to withdraw approval for this drug. Because, of course,
Right.
those decisions are made on research and so on. And, what we know is that mifepristone is an incredibly safe drug that has actually been repurposed
Hmm.
for chemical abortions. Um, What's also interesting about the system is that Kazmarek's order was then countered by an order issued by a district court judge in Washington state, and 19 state attorneys general took the case to them. So, judge shopping, as you were saying, is entirely bipartisan. What's interesting to me about this is it overlaps with Donald Trump's incredibly personal relationship to the law and the
Hmm.
ways in which he sees judges as personal friends or personal enemies. And obviously, we saw this when he was being prosecuted and taken to court in various places. I remember there was one judge who was of Mexican descent who he accused of being against him because he was Mexican. Um, so he makes these incredibly personal attacks on judges. But in fact, the judicial system is not supposed to be personal, right? It's
Not at
supposed
all.
to be about interpretations of the law. So how do we think about the Trump administration's refusal to pay attention to the courts, except when they get a decision that they like?
There's a reason that Lady Justice has a blindfold over her eyes, right?
Yep.
Impartial justice. This is the Roy Cohn effect, right? I mean, this is really a lesson that Trump took from his long relationship with Roy Cohn, and that you can game the system. You find a judge that works for you best. If there's a backroom deal, if there's some handshaking, some money that's passed. This is how you do. This is how you win stuff,
Right.
and that's certainly how he led his personal life and his business life. Not surprising that this is the philosophy he's brought into the entire way his administration is approaching the law. Um, the question is, what is this administration doing about following court orders? I mean, I think to so far what they're doing is pushing the limits of what can happen, right? And I think that's what's happening a lot with the executive orders they're doing. I think it's obviously very useful to them to kind of create a politics around this too, with like Carolyn Levitt's statement about judge shopping and radical judges and all the ways in which they become obsessed on the judiciary. I mean, this is the new, right? It used to be the media, it used to be the academy, it's now the legal system. And so that's in keeping with like conservative attack on institutions as being the sole sort of like problem for the entire nation. But it's quite a development that it has moved from like attacks on the media or attacks on the academy or academia to an attack on one of the equal branches of government.
Right. Right. And of course, the philosophy that the Trump administration is operating under is something they call the unitary executive, which
Right.
is a right wing interpretation of the Constitution that says the president basically is in charge of everything. And so the Trump administration is working under the assumption that everything Trump wants is the law of the land, regardless of laws that Congress has passed, regardless of whether these things are constitutional or not. And we're really seeing that play out on social media. I mean, I think the
Yeah,
discourse about Abrego Garcia, the man who was deported to El Salvador wrongly, there are apparently new documents now that have been vetted by Axios and Fox News, but Fox News had to dig them up. That there are sort of multiple occasions in which he and his wife had encounters with each other that were violent, and
right,
so, what the MAGA sphere keeps trying to say is, is this the person you want back? They've accused him of being an MS-13 member, which he isn't. Blah blah blah. And of course, the response to all of that is always due process, the
right,
rule of law. But from their point of view, if the President Trump, identifies someone who should not be in this country, it is legal to get rid of this person. That is due process from their
right,
perspective,
exactly. And
right?
judges just exist to rubber stamp that executive action,
Right. Which
which
is, of
is
course, autocracy.
exactly, and also not a division of powers at all. And but I think exactly is part of that sort of right
Right.
wing philosophy that you noted of just executive power.
Right.
And I think that the thing that like they add to that conversation, or that Caroline Levitt said it in that clip we had, although I don't know if it was part of what we just listened to, was like, this is a duly elected president. So this is also,
Right.
the will of the people. So
Right.
it's, he is the carrier of the will of the people. He is acting in a way that the nation has already asked for him to do. And judges, this one guy out there, right? This one radical plant, this one Democratic, appointed judge, although that's not true in so many of these cases, is upending the will of the people as expressed by this president.
Yeah, and I want to just sort of roll our listeners hundreds of years back in time for a second, because this is something the framers were keenly aware of. That in a democracy, you could have a majority that was oppressive to the minority, and you could have a minority that was deeply discontented. And of course, we see that explode in 1860 in the Civil War, in which that minority, or that part of the United States that sees itself becoming a permanent minority, decides, the hell with it, we're forming our own nation and it will be a slaveholding nation forever. Um, this is one of the reasons that the framers created a judicial branch of government as co-equal, that there actually had to be an independent arbiter to interpret the Constitution and interpret the law in such a way that neither the minority or the majority could dominate. Now, the part that I think is actually kind of tricky about this is that the Supreme Court has become a part of the political system, in the sense that since the 1960s, we have talked about presidential appointments as cementing certain points of view about governance.
Right.
And so the language about legislating from the bench, which Caroline Levitt is using, although she's using it incorrectly, when somebody puts forward an injunction, they are not, in fact, legislating. But Brown v. Board of Education might legitimately be thought
Hmm.
of as legislation from the bench, because, in fact, it nullified a range of laws that separated the races. Um, so when we're thinking about legislating from the bench, how do we imagine a weak Congress um, sort of taking a role in what is increasingly becoming a confrontation between the judicial branch and the executive?
Well, it doesn't seem like this Congress has indicated in any way that it is interested in that role.
Yeah,
I mean, I don't think that that's a reality of right now. Maybe a post 2026, cross your fingers, we had the election and the results happen in the
right,
way they should,
right,
might start to assert its powers,
right,
and to push back on on the executive's infringement here, but I think this only speaks to like the court, the judiciary doesn't have enforcement powers.
Right.
That this system works in many ways because of trust and because of
Right.
adherence to the system and to the division of power. And this raises this question of like, are we in a constitutional crisis or not?
Right.
And those who are saying no are, not yet, but we're close. They're saying, well, he hasn't actually not adhered to a decision yet, right? Like he hasn't actually violated an order yet. But even there seems to be some interpretive room. Like, what does it mean to
Yeah.
violate an order, right? If you're
Right.
not, in the case of bringing, the person back from El Salvador,
Right.
in what time period?
Right.
They're about to get to it. Like that's the way they can say that
Right.
they haven't violated it. But for those who are arguing he has, or that this is a constitutional crisis, it's not about a particular court decision or a particular response of the administration to the court's decision. It's the larger philosophy at work, which is that through executive action, they are doing things that they know to be unconstitutional, and that they are actively doing that to test the constraints on their power.
Right. No, I think that's absolutely right. And I was thinking earlier when we were talking about the power of the courts to enforce, which they basically don't. They rely on the executive for enforcement. So what we see
Right.
during the civil rights era, for example, is that when Southern governors defy court orders, the president
Right.
sends in the National Guard
Yeah.
to walk little children into school and so on. But what the Trump administration has decided to experiment with is enforcement power that is, of course, denying massive amounts of federal funding, not just to institutions like Harvard and Penn and Brown, but also to entire states. His confrontation with Janet Mills over transgender athletes. And Janet Mills memorably says, I am enforcing state and federal laws. Donald Trump responds by saying, I am the federal law.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is really just kind of astonishing.
It is.
So what Trump says is, all right, well, how will you like it when I take millions of dollars away from your state?
Yeah.
So that is his enforcement. It is a kind of punishment for defying what are otherwise unconstitutional orders.
Yeah, and they're going to use that tactic over and over again,
Right.
because it's a really effective one, or at least it is, as long as there's not, the court stepping in or
Right.
Congress acting again. But I think that, I am the federal law. That goes back to what we just sort of were talking about, 1803, Marbury v. Madison, right? Like
Yep.
that foundational Supreme Court case. Not surprising in 1803 that the Supreme Court, right, would
Right.
say, okay, no, we don't have a
Right.
king. We don't have a king here. The highest law of the land is the Constitution,
Right.
not, the president. And that's where we are. This is the foundational case of the court, and also really the foundational case of our entire system
Right.
of divided power.
Yeah, and I want to actually build on that a little bit because there are two people I'd like to end thinking about. One is Amy Coney Barrett, and one is John Roberts, and I'm interested in them for all kinds of reasons. But one of the things that the media has been doing for years is every time there's a controversial order in a lower court, they will identify who appointed the judge. They'll say it's a Clinton judge, it's a Reagan judge, although there are not so many Reagan judges left. It was a Bush judge, an Obama judge, as if that should tell us everything we need to know about the decision, which I actually think is just wrong. But it's become kind of useful to have these modifiers because all of a sudden we're seeing Reagan judges and Bush judges becoming a brake on the Trump system, and they are stepping up in defense of the law. So this is why I'm interested in Amy Coney Barrett. Okay. One of the most popular posts on Political Junkie is my post about Amy Coney Barrett, which is kind of derisive and snide. And over time, I have to tell you, Neil, I have come to admire the woman. Not because we have a whole lot in common politically, but because she is emerging in a kind of Sandra Day O'Connor way as an independent, moderate voice on the court. Why do you think she's able to do that?
Well, I agree with you as well that I have come to admire her. I'm not sure that she's emerging as an independent, moderate voice. I do think she's emerging as an independent voice, but I think I would just tweak that and to say she's emerging as an independent, conservative voice.
Right.
And that what we have happening on the right is a collapse of conservatism for Trumpism. And that she is someone that we could absolutely imagine having been appointed by Reagan or by Bush, and existing within that realm as a absolutely clearly identifiable, consistent conservative voice
Right.
and judge. And I think that that's how she's acting now. But it looks certainly it is independent, but it even looks of moderation, given the form of republicanism or the form of conservatism that we now see, which is Trumpism. So I think we should admire her as someone who's committed to her own like political philosophy and judicial philosophy, that she is not budging from, but that one that puts her in conflict with a lot of what Trump is trying to do. And it reminds me of those, attorneys in New York who abandoned their post as opposed to going forward with what they saw as a violation of law. They were, like Federalist Society conservatives, as I believe Amy Barrett is as well. So I think that this is like, I'm not sure she's going to be Sandra Day O'Connor. I did sort of think of David Souter.
Yes.
But I don't think she'll be David Souter either, right? A sort of a conservative jurist who was appointed by George H.W. Bush, who then became really, I think, a fairly consistent liberal in the last couple of years. So I don't think there's a political transformation of her that's happening, but I may be wrong about that. She's only a couple of years into her Supreme Court career. I mean, there may be a evolution that's happening for her judicially and politically, but I see her more just operating as conservative, and that conservatism again puts her in conflict with a lot of what Trump is doing.
Yeah. So here's a loaded question that I want to ask you too, and it may just be a fantasy of mine, but I sometimes wonder if her Catholicism is part of what distinguishes her. That there are places she will not go. It's very common for people to say dismissively about Trump and his various cronies, the cruelty is the point.
Right.
Amy Coney Barrett often in arguments seems appalled by cruelty.
I agree.
And so, to the extent that she is often on the side of a ruling, say, about transgender kids that I disagree with, I don't actually get the take from her that she wants them to disappear. I get the sense from her that she is working within the law and that she's working within a set of sincere beliefs about family and humanity that she, that are thoughtful. What do you think?
I think that there's a lot to be said about that. I think sincere beliefs is the right way. I think that that's what she's shown us.
Right.
Sincere and consistent beliefs.
Right.
And those may be beliefs that often lead to decisions that, you and I would not agree with. But I think that we can see a consistency from her that is inflected by a deep Catholicism. I mean, she really is a devout, from everything that's been reported about her,
right,
a devout religious adherent.
Right.
And in many ways that shows up, I think, in our political framework and in sort of deeply conservative positions. But also this is a Catholic, I think there's a Catholic social theory at work there.
Yep.
That also seems to be shaping these ideas that don't allow her to take up the cruelty that I think has been normalized and that is sort of central to Trump logic, to Trump political philosophy, to Trump, judicial strategies that she seems not at all willing to, and in fact that she's going to speak out against.
Yeah. Well, and the last person I'd like to focus on, and we can't really draw any conclusions because we're just going to have to wait to see how all of this plays out, is, of course, John Roberts. This will be known as the Roberts Court. John Roberts has a place in history that no one else on the court is going to have because it will be the body of decisions that is made by his court will be known as Roberts decisions, and they will be historically grouped together as something that pushed the United States in a particular direction. Part of what is at stake for him, I think, right now, is whether, in fact, Trump is going to seize the wheel of history
Right.
and take it and leave the Supreme Court in the dust. And John Roberts is a very interesting character, I think, because he was a real conservative activist, like Brett Kavanaugh. He made
Mm-hmm.
his way through all of those conservative institutions, and went to work in the Department of Justice. To what wasn't Roberts part of the Starr
I
investigation?
believe so. Yeah.
Yeah, as Kavanaugh was.
Yes.
So Roberts has a history as a partisan, which when he became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, he deliberately divorced himself from, and very, to put it bluntly, judiciously, moved away from politics as a framework for what he was doing. Um, Roberts, on the other hand, my friend Dahlia Lithwick talks about this, about how he's an incrementalist, that
Yeah.
he has some of the same goals that very radically right people do, but he understands those goals as being the result of years of work, laying bricks, laying frameworks, that you go one place, but you say, oh, but we're leaving this other thing out. And you wait for the case that brings that other thing to you. So he's a man that believes profoundly in the law, who is actually in a position to be a hero at one of the most lawless times in American history, right?
That's right. And I think, listen, every chief justice is mindful of their legacy, right? For all the
Right.
reasons you just sketched out. Of every court case is going to be, grouped under him as the header, and it will be the historical. It will be, how history is interpreted.
Right.
Um, and I think that so that's not a surprising sort of position for a chief justice to be in, or to be mindful of. Everything that's been reported about him, though, is that he's also particularly mindful of his own reputation. And I think that what's the story about him is that he imagines his reputation as tied to what the court does,
Right.
and around questions of its own legitimacy, and that it not becoming a political organ.
Right.
And so all of that puts him again in conflict with Trump philosophy, Trump strategy here. But that, like, the greatest legacy of him might be how he stood up to a Republican president.
Right.
I mean, that's very, I think, as you said, we don't know where all this is headed, but it seems quite likely that that's where we are headed.
Right.
And I don't think
Right.
any Chief Justice wants to see the Supreme Court rendered meaningless, inconsequential. But John Roberts, particularly, I do not think is going to allow the Supreme Court to not be an equal branch of government, or for the judiciary to not be an equal branch of government, and for the Supreme Court to be, as you said, left in the dust.
Yeah, and of course Donald Trump has sworn to defend the Constitution, has every single member of the GOP in Congress, and they're all liars. They're horrible, horrible liars. But it is John Roberts' sacred trust to defend
Well,
that
and
Constitution.
and we need to wrap up, and this could be its own conversation, but I do think what I see happening, especially online, is a growing conservative's not even the right word anymore, a growing conversation about doing away with the Constitution. You're seeing
Right.
it happen on X.
Yep.
It's bubbling from the fringes. It will probably be, I don't know, part of the Republican Party platform in 2032.
Yep.
That the Constitution needs to be disbanded. And so, all those originalists, all those strict constructionists,
Yep.
they're going to be, many of them are going to be saying, we need to get rid of the Constitution and just, put Trump into power forever.
You're right. That's a whole
that very much is going
episode.
to happen.
That is a whole episode in and of itself. All right. So before things get really scary, we're going to talk about what we want to go viral. And as usual, I'm going to let you go first, Neil.
All right, I've been like on the book beat for a while. I'm going to tell another book, and I have another like cover to show everyone if it shows up here. Sister Sinner. Oh, I can't read it backwards. The Miraculous Life and Mysterious Disappearance of Amy Semple McPherson. This has only been out a week or two.
Oh my God.
Claire Hoffman. It's so good. If you don't know who Amy Semple McPherson is, she is one of the most important figures in American religious history. She comes out of the Pentecostal charismatic wing of evangelicalism in the 1920s. She's from Canada. She's sort of like a traveling revivalist in the early 20th century America, moves to Los Angeles in the 1920s when this town was just, barely starting to become a city. And she created this church, which is still in existence today, that was at the time was the largest church in the world, had about 6,000 members. She is involved. She's just becomes this huge, like deeply influential figure in American religious life. I mean, you don't have the mega church. You don't have like modern day evangelicalism. You don't have folks like Joel Osteen and really that run the gamut of American evangelicalism from Billy Graham to Joel Osteen, really without, I think, the example and the sort of precedence of Amy Semple McPherson. But she is involved in this enormous scandal in 1926 at the height of her fame when she goes swimming in the Pacific Ocean off of Venice Beach and disappears for over a month. And everyone, of course, thinks that she's, drowned, that she's been pulled out to sea. And a little over a month later, she is found wandering in the desert in Mexico. And she claims that she's been kidnapped by gangsters because she was going after, sort of the vices and the underworld of Los Angeles, and that they had conspired to kidnap her, and that she escaped from this kidnapping, and sort of she's saved by God, right? And this makes her even more famous because, of course, she's come out of the wilderness, she's escaped death and all that. It was pretty obvious that it was all a fraud. Los Angeles Police Department and the city of Los Angeles basically pursue a legal case against her, and that's what the bulk of this book is about. It's a real page turner, and I'm actually going to write an essay about it for Religion Dispatches. So I'm still thinking through sort of what I want to say about it. But it's a total page turner of a book. I know that a lot of the reviewers have their reviews have focused on like, she's who basically creates American evangelicalism in the 20th century. And I think that's not wrong, but there are so many resonances here with Trump and Trumpism and the cult of celebrity and the cult of personality around her, and the way in which scandal actually makes a figure in American life all the more beloved, all the more only increases their followers and their devotions to them, because all of it is sort of presented through their own persecution, right? Like the law came after me because the law wants to come after you.
Yeah.
And so I'm seeing resonances, not necessarily with Joel Osteen or with, modern day evangelicalism as much as I am with our political moment and our, and the person at the front of our politics. So maybe that's what I'll write about.
Oh my God. I've been fascinated with Amy Semple McPherson my entire life. The first season of the revived Perry Mason was about Amy Semple McPherson.
Yeah.
And it was great. But I think, also the connection to Los Angeles, which you mentioned at the beginning, Neil, is so important to why she's able to do this, because Los Angeles is a place that is reimagining itself. It's becoming itself, and it's not there yet. And, there are all these people moving out from New York and starting movie studios, and they're like building sets in the middle of nowhere and, taking people who are completely unknown and turning them into stars and so on. So it's that atmosphere in many ways that she really speaks to as much as anything else.
Yeah, I'm loving it as much as a history of Los Angeles as it is of, other things. So I highly recommend the book. It's a real quick read, and I think you'll learn a lot.
Fantastic. I'm going to get it immediately. So I'm going to take us in a different direction. My thing that I would like to go viral this week is an FX miniseries called Dying for Sex. And it's based on the experience of a woman named Molly Cochan who survived breast cancer at 32, only to have a stage 4 recurrence some years later. And what happens to her is she realizes that because she's going to die, she doesn't want to die with a husband who basically bores her and with whom she has never had an orgasm. And there are lots of really, interesting things about Molly. There's an experience she has very early in life of being sexually abused by her mother's boyfriend. So that's part of the story. But Molly, for the next 4 years, blogged and wrote a memoir and did a podcast about her various sexual adventures and basically a bucket list of things she wanted to do before she died. One of which is she wanted to have an orgasm, which she'd never had. So this sounds like, I thought it was way too weird to watch. And we decided to try it because one of our relatives suggested it. And it is riveting. It is funny. It is moving. It is touching. It's not maudlin about death. I read some of the reviews that said, some people think there's a little too much sex in it. I actually think the sex is extremely tasteful and very erotic. And it is a really excellent example of what a woman-centered television show about sex and sexuality would look like. It was perfect. I couldn't find anything to criticize, including the male characters were fantastic. There's one man in particular, and I won't tell listeners who it is, but there's one man in particular who becomes her sort of muse to get to the orgasm. And it's not spoiling anything to say she does in fact die at the end. There is a character part played by Sissy Spacek. Sissy Spacek plays her mother. And as a small aside, I just want to say there are very few actresses that I love more than Sissy Spacek, but who I admire more because right now she's at a moment in her career where she just does whatever she wants. And she plays these sort of cameo roles in various series. And she does it beautifully. And she's old. And she's not afraid to look old. So Dying for Sex, they are 8 half-hour episodes. It is a limited series because, of course, Molly dies at the end. And I couldn't recommend it more. We binged it in 3 days.
So have you not listened to the podcast that it's based
I
on?
have not listened to the podcast. Should
Okay. I cannot it's my favorite podcast ever made. It is
Wow.
unbelievable.
Wow.
It's also shaping my experience of watching the show, which I've only seen a few episodes of. But I also have enjoyed the show. The podcast is unbelievable. And really it's a story about, yes, it's all about those things that are going on in Molly's life. But ultimately the podcast, and I assume the show itself, is really about the friendship, the beautiful love of
Yes.
these two women, these two
Yes.
friends. And it is overwhelming in podcast form. I'm not sure how it plays out on the show. I also listened to the podcast a year after one of my best friends died of colon cancer. So it was an incredibly emotional experience for me, but I would say rush to listen to that podcast. It is truly an accomplishment and will deeply impact you.
I will, in fact, listen to the podcast. I'm also thinking about getting her memoir. I would also say, Neil, and thank you for telling us about your friend. One of the things I liked most about the series is that it talks very frankly about dying and
Yeah.
what dying is like, and that you can actually learn how to die,
Mm-hmm.
which is not how we normally talk about death. And so I will be very interested to listen to the podcast. Neil, as always, it's been a pleasure.
Really good to talk to you.